The universe, in its infinite wisdom and questionable sense of humor, had arranged itself into a neat little hierarchy. At the top sat the Zephyrian Empire, 7 feet of crystalline exoskeleton and razor-sharp wit, convinced they were evolution's masterpiece. Below them, arranged in descending order of perceived usefulness, were the other species of the galaxy. And at the very bottom, somewhere between the parasitic glorblings and actual space debris, were humans. Now the Zephyrians had earned their spot at the top through a combination of superior technology, ruthless efficiency, and the kind of military prowess that made other species wet themselves at the mere mention of their name. Their homeworld Catalyst Prime was a testament to their superiority, gleaming spires of bioengineered crystal that reached toward the stars like accusatory fingers, pointing out just how pathetic everyone else's architecture was by comparison. The Zephyrians took pride in their warrior culture, where strength was measured not just in physical prowess, but in the ability to endure pain, overcome adversity, and protect the pack. Their young, called cubs, were sacred beyond measure. A single cub represented the future of their bloodline, their genetic legacy, their hopes and dreams wrapped up in a package of developing exoskeleton and oversized compound eyes that could melt the hardest heart. Which made it all the more ironic that the species they considered barely above pond scum would soon rewrite their entire understanding of courage. Melody Chen had never intended to become a galactic legend. She'd barely intended to become a decent maintenance worker if she was being honest, but here she was, 3 years into her contract on Catalyst Prime, armed with nothing but a toolkit, a stubborn streak, and the kind of quiet competence that kept atmospheric processors running and settlements breathing. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd traveled halfway across the galaxy to fix air conditioning for aliens who thought she was evolutionary waste. Every morning she'd wake up in her cramped quarters in the human sector, grab her gear and head out to whatever mechanical crisis awaited her in the Zephyrian settlements. The work was steady, the pay was decent, and if she could ignore the occasional comment about her primitive mammalian inadequacies, it was almost tolerable. The Zephyrians had a particular talent for making their disdain known without actually saying anything actionable. They'd step aside when she walked past, not out of courtesy but to avoid contamination. They'd speak about her in third person while she was standing right there, as if she were a malfunctioning piece of equipment rather than a sentient being, the adults anyway. The cubs were different. Cubs didn't know they were supposed to look down on humans yet. They were curious, playful, and possessed of that universal childhood trait of befriending absolutely anyone who showed them the slightest bit of kindness. That's how Melody had met Krix'tal. The young Zephyrian had been barely 3 cycles old when he'd first encountered the strange, soft-skinned alien working on the atmospheric processor outside his family's dwelling. While his parents watched with barely concealed horror, Krix'tal had toddled over and stared up at Melody with those enormous compound eyes, head tilted in that peculiar way that seemed to be universal among curious children, regardless of species. "You're very small," he'd observed in his piping voice, speaking in heavily accented Standard Galactic. "You're very observant," Melody had replied, not looking up from her work. And that had been the beginning of a friendship that would have scandalized polite Zephyrian society, if polite Zephyrian society had bothered to pay attention to what their cubs were up to. Over the following months, Krix'tal had taken to following Melody around during her work in his sector. He'd chatter away about his lessons, his playmates, his dreams of growing up to be a great warrior like his parents. Melody would listen, offering the occasional comment or question, treating him with the same casual respect she'd show any conversation partner. It was revolutionary, in its own small way. Here was a human treating a Zephyrian cub not as a sacred object to be worshipped from afar, but as a person. And here was a Zephyrian cub learning that humans weren't the mindless drones his elders claimed they were. The friendship might have continued indefinitely, a small bright spot in an otherwise routine existence, if not for the fact that the universe has a twisted sense of timing. The morning of the accident had started like any other. Melody had been called out to the industrial sector to address a fluctuation in one of the primary energy conduits. It was routine maintenance, the kind of job she could do with her eyes closed. The conduit was one of the massive channels that carried power from the settlement's central reactor to the various districts. a river of barely contained energy that hummed with the kind of power that could level city blocks if it ever got loose. Krix'tal had, as usual, tagged along despite his parents' disapproval. He'd been perched on a nearby maintenance platform, swinging his legs and regaling Melody with a detailed account of his latest lessons in combat theory when the world decided to explode. Later, the investigators would determine that a microfracture in the conduit housing had been slowly widening over the course of several cycles, weakened by metal fatigue and the constant stress of containing energies that weren't meant to be contained. The failure, when it came, was catastrophic. The conduit didn't just break, it erupted. A column of raw energy punched through the housing like a giant fist, sending chunks of superheated metal flying in all directions. The explosion was so violent that it registered on seismic sensors 3 sectors away. The blast wave shattered windows, triggered emergency sirens, and sent every living thing within a quarter-mile radius diving for cover. Melody had exactly 1.3 seconds to process what was happening. She saw the conduit breach, saw the energy discharge, saw the massive piece of twisted metal spinning through the air like a deadly frisbee, and realized with crystalline clarity that it was heading straight for Krix'tal. The young Zephyrian was frozen in place, his compound eyes wide with terror, his developing reflexes nowhere near fast enough to get him out of the way. The chunk of metal, still glowing with residual energy, was going to hit him dead center. In that split second, Melody Chen made a decision that would echo through the halls of Zephyrian history for generations to come. She didn't think about the consequences, didn't weigh the odds, didn't consider the irony of a weak human protecting a member of the superior species. She simply moved. Melody launched herself off the platform, her trajectory calculated with the kind of precision that comes from years of working in 3-dimensional spaces. She hit Krix'tal in a flying tackle that would have made a professional athlete proud, wrapping her arms around the cub and using her momentum to carry them both out of the path of the spinning debris. The metal shard that would have killed Krix'tal instantly instead caught Melody across the back, the superheated edge slicing through her environmental suit and into the flesh beneath. But that wasn't the worst of it. The real danger came from the energy discharge itself. The raw, unfiltered power that had been contained within the conduit was now free, and it was highly radioactive. Melody absorbed a dose of radiation that would have killed most species instantly. Her body, already damaged by the physical impact, was being cooked from the inside out by energies that human physiology was never meant to encounter. She felt her nervous system beginning to shut down, felt her organs failing one by one, felt her vision dimming as her brain struggled to process the cascade of damage. But she held on long enough to make sure Krix'tal was breathing, long enough to push him toward the approaching emergency responders, long enough to whisper, "Get him to safety." Then Melody Chen, maintenance worker and accidental hero, collapsed. The medical bay of Ketalos Prime had never seen anything quite like it. Dr. Zalthara, the settlement's chief medical officer, was a competent professional who treated everything from combat wounds to exotic diseases, but she'd never had to deal with a human who'd absorbed enough radiation to power a small city. The readings were off the charts. By all rights, Melody should have been dead 3 times over. Her cellular structure was breaking down at the molecular level, her organs were shutting down in sequence, and her brain activity was fluctuating wildly. But somehow, impossibly, she was still alive. "Stubborn species," Dr. Zalthara muttered as she worked, her 6 arms moving with practiced efficiency as she administered treatment after treatment. They refused to die properly. Krix'tal had been treated for minor cuts and shock, but his physical injuries were nothing compared to the psychological impact of what he'd witnessed. The cub sat in the corner of the medical bay, his compound eyes fixed on Melody's still form, and refused to leave. "She saved me," he kept repeating to anyone who would listen. "The soft skin saved me. She jumped in front of the metal, she jumped in front of it." Word spread through the settlement like wildfire. A human had saved a Zephyrian cub, not just any human, but the quiet maintenance worker who'd been living among them for years, invisible and ignored. The same species they'd dismissed as weak and worthless had produced someone willing to die for one of their young. Commander Vexmoth, the settlement's leader, arrived at the medical bay to find a crowd gathered outside. Zephyrian adults who'd never given humans a second thought were now pressing for updates on Melody's condition. Parents who'd previously forbidden their cubs from interacting with the inferior species were now reconsidering their positions. "Status report," Vexmoth demanded as she strode into the medical bay, her crystalline exoskeleton catching the light and casting rainbow patterns on the walls. "Stable, but critical," Dr. Zalthara replied without looking up from her patient. "The radiation exposure should have killed her immediately. The fact that she survived long enough to reach us suggests that human physiology is more resilient than we previously believed." "And the cub?" "Physically unharmed. Emotionally, that's another matter." Commander Vexmoth looked down at Krix'tal, who was still maintaining his vigil beside Melody's bed. The cub's parents had tried to convince him to leave, but he'd refused, insisting that he needed to stay with his friend. "Tell me what happened," Vexmoth said, crouching down to bring herself to the cub's eye level. Krix'tal's account was halting and punctuated by what humans would have recognized as tears, though the Zephyrian equivalent was more like a crystalline secretion from their compound eyes. He described the explosion, the flying debris, and Melody's impossible leap to save him. "She didn't hesitate," Krix'tal said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She saw the metal coming and she jumped. She knew it would hurt her, but she jumped anyway." The adults in the room exchanged glances. This wasn't the behavior they'd expected from a species they'd classified as inherently selfish and cowardly. This was the kind of selfless sacrifice they associated with the greatest of their own warriors. As news of the incident spread beyond the settlement, it sparked conversations that hadn't occurred in Zephyrian society for generations. What did it mean that a human had shown such courage? What did it say about their own prejudices? And most importantly, what did they owe to someone who'd risked everything to save one of their young? The answer, it turned out, was everything. Melody's recovery was slow and painful. The radiation had damaged her body at the cellular level, and human medical technology wasn't advanced enough to fully repair the damage. But Zephyrian medicine was, and Dr. Zalthara threw herself into the challenge with the dedication of someone who'd found her life's work. "Fascinating," the doctor murmured as she worked, regenerating damaged tissue with precision tools that hadn't been designed for human anatomy. "The cellular structure is completely different from ours, but the underlying principles are the same. Pain is pain, healing is healing, courage is courage." The entire settlement watched Melody's progress with an intensity that would have been unthinkable just days before. Daily bulletins were issued on her condition, children drew pictures of her heroic leap, adults who'd never spoken to a human began asking questions about their species, their culture, their capabilities. When Melody finally woke up, 3 weeks after the accident, she found herself in a world that had fundamentally changed. The first face she saw was Krix'tal's, the young Zephyrian having maintained his vigil through her entire recovery. "You're awake," he said, and the relief in his voice was unmistakable. "How long?" Melody asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. 21 cycles. "You were hurt very badly. Dr. Zalthara said you might not wake up." Melody tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Every muscle in her body felt like it had been individually disassembled and put back together by someone working from incomplete instructions. "Take it slowly," came a voice from across the room. Dr. Zalthara approached, her medical scanner already active. "You've been through more trauma than most beings experience in a lifetime. Your body needs time to adjust." "Krix'tal," Melody said, ignoring the doctor's advice and focusing on the cub. "Are you hurt?" The question seemed to surprise everyone in the room. Here was someone who'd nearly died saving a child, and her first concern upon waking was whether he was safe. "I'm fine," Krix'tal said, his compound eyes bright with unshed tears. You saved me and you almost died." "You're worth saving," Melody replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. The ceremony, when it came, was unlike anything in Zephyrian history. The entire settlement gathered in the central plaza, a space normally reserved for military celebrations and religious observances. At the center stood a hastily constructed platform where Commander Vexmoth waited with an honor guard of the settlement's finest warriors. Melody, still weak from her injuries but determined to attend, was escorted to the platform by Krix'tal and his parents. The crowd, which included not just Zephyrians but representatives from other species who'd heard the story, watched in respectful silence. "Today," Commander Vexmoth began, her voice carrying across the plaza, We gather to honor an act of courage that has redefined our understanding of strength. Melody Chen, human maintenance worker, threw herself into mortal danger to save the life of Krix'tal, son of Torgen and Nihilisa. In doing so, she demonstrated the kind of selfless bravery that we hold as the highest virtue of our people. The commander paused, looking out over the assembled crowd. It has been suggested that this act was anomalous, that it doesn't represent the true nature of her species. I believe otherwise. I believe that courage, true courage, exists in all species. We simply haven't been looking hard enough to see it. The formal declaration came next. Melody Chen was named an honorary pack mother, a title that had never been bestowed on an alien before. She was granted citizenship in the settlement, along with all the rights and privileges that entailed. Most importantly, she was given the protection of the pack, meaning that any threat to her would be considered a threat to the entire community. We have learned something important today, Commander Vexmuth concluded. Strength is not measured in the thickness of one's exoskeleton or the power of one's weapons. It is measured in the willingness to sacrifice for others, to stand between danger and the innocent, to choose love over fear. In these measures, Melody Chen has proven herself to be among the strongest beings we have ever known. The crowd erupted in approval, a sound that could be heard throughout the settlement. But the real measure of the ceremony's impact came later, when the plaza began to empty, and individuals approached Melody personally. They came in ones and twos at first, then in larger groups. Zephyrians who'd never spoken to a human before, wanting to thank her, to shake her hand, to tell her that she'd changed their minds about her species. Parents brought their cubs to meet her. Children who'd been forbidden from interacting with aliens now encouraged to learn from her example. "You've started something," Dr. Zalthara told her as they watched the crowd. "This won't end with one ceremony. You've shown them that their assumptions were wrong. That's going to have consequences." She was right. Within a month, the story of Melody Chen had spread beyond Ketalos Prime. Other settlements began questioning their own prejudices. The Galactic Council, that august body of species representatives, found themselves dealing with a sudden influx of proposals for human integration programs. The irony wasn't lost on anyone with half a brain. The species that had been dismissed as weak and worthless had produced someone who embodied the very virtues that the superior species claimed to value most. It was a lesson in humility that the galaxy badly needed. But perhaps the most significant change was the statue. Erected in the center of the plaza where the ceremony had taken place, it depicted Melody in the moment of her leap, arms wrapped around Krix'tal, her face set in determined concentration. The inscription, written in both Zephyrian and Standard Galactic, read simply, "Courage knows no species." Melody herself remained characteristically modest about the whole affair. She returned to her job maintaining atmospheric processes, though now she was accompanied by a steady stream of visitors who wanted to meet the cub saver. She answered their questions with the same patient competence she brought to her work, never claiming to be anything more than someone who'd done what needed to be done. "I'm not a hero," she'd tell anyone who asked. "I'm just someone who couldn't stand by and watch a child get hurt. Anyone would have done the same thing." But that, of course, was the point. The galaxy had been so focused on what made species different that they'd forgotten what made them the same. The capacity for love, for sacrifice, for choosing to protect the innocent. These weren't traits exclusive to any one species. They were universal constants, as fundamental as gravity or the speed of light. Years later, when historians looked back on the incident, they would mark it as the beginning of a new era in galactic relations. The Melody Chen incident, as it came to be known, became a case study in the dangers of prejudice and the power of individual action to change the world. But for Melody herself, the real reward was much simpler. Every morning when she headed out to work on whatever mechanical crisis awaited her, she was accompanied by Krix'tal, now grown into a young adult but still devoted to his friend. They'd walk through the settlement together, talking about their plans for the day, their hopes for the future, their shared memories of the moment when everything changed. And if their friendship had taught the galaxy anything, it was that sometimes the most profound truths come from the most unlikely places. Sometimes the weakest among us turn out to be the strongest. Sometimes the most ordinary moments become the stuff of legend. Sometimes, a maintenance worker with a stubborn streak and a good heart can rewrite the rules of an entire civilization, one small act of courage at a time. The universe, in its infinite wisdom and questionable sense of humor, had indeed arranged itself into a hierarchy, but thanks to one human's refusal to accept the predetermined order of things, that hierarchy would never look quite the same again. After all, when legends are born from love, everyone gets to be a little bit stronger.